These are the tasks for informative speaking. The tasks to accomplish in the introduction, body, and conclusion of an informative speech presentation. In the introduction, there are 4 tasks I want you to make a plan to accomplish in the introduction of your informative speeches. And they are to establish the main idea, establish common ground with the audience, establish a personal connection to the subject, and preview a specific number of points to be included in detail in the body. Let's go over these one at a time. Establish the main idea. What is the thesis statement or universal point that you mean to convey to your audience? You will know that you have an acceptable main idea if it passes the main idea smell test, which is the 4 criteria that a main idea must meet in order for it to be considered to be well developed. The 4 criteria of the main idea smell test are as follows. Your main idea must be universal, not autobiographical, be able to be expressed in a complete grammatical sentence, assert a singular idea, and make an assertion that is beyond the obvious and not overly simplistic. Those are the 4 criteria you should keep in mind as you develop your main idea and work it into the presentation. The next task, establish common ground with your audience. Briefly reveal something about yourself that humanizes you or establishes you as, in some way, just like us in the audience. You're one of us. Standing in front of the room or in front of the camera is a barrier between you and the audience. So you want to bridge that gap by revealing something about yourself. You got caught up in the same traffic on the way to work today. You're dealing with backed up laundry at home, some common issue. It should be very brief, and if possible, if you can make it a segue into the information you came to talk about, even better. The next task, establish a personal connection to the subject. By establishing common ground with your audience, getting us to see you as one of us in some way, and then showing why you care about the issue, the subject you came to talk about, we hopefully will then see why we should care. In order to do this, establish a personal connection or credibility with regard to your subject, you should plan to briefly answer the following questions. First question, how did you come across this information? And second question, what is a personality trait of yours that caused you to value and remember this information when you did come across it? Because there might have been someone else, your brother, your friend, who came across the same information at the same time as you, but it didn't resonate with them. Why did it resonate with you? So if you make a plan to answer those 2 questions as briefly as possible, that will usually help you a long way towards establishing the personal connection. Preview a specific number of points. These are points that will be covered in detail in the body. If the body of your speech is predominantly descriptive, give each point a name and list them briefly. That's for descriptive content. If the body of your speech is predominantly narrative, a story, then you should do something a little bit different. You should preview by mentioning the time frame of the story. The time frame of the story is the period of time during which the story takes place. Technically speaking, the time frame of the story is the period of time in terms of story structure between the initial conflict and the moment of the climax of the story. So, for example, you might mention that the story takes place over a period of 2 weeks. This is worthwhile and not the same and better than saying something vague like this story happened 8 years ago. Saying it happened over 2 weeks gives the audience a clear idea of how to follow the details of the story, while saying it happened 8 years ago doesn't give them a clear indication of how they can gauge whether or not you're keeping the story moving at a good pace. So mention the time frame of the story if your content is narrative, and that will serve as your preview. Now we move on to the body of the speech. When you're speaking to inform, as we are in the first 3 speeches in this course, you have one task in the body: to elaborate in detail on those points previewed, giving specific examples and using facts and or testimony for support. So be thorough and elaborate in detail. If you preview 3 points, cover in detail 3 points with examples and clear transitions. If you preview 4 points, cover 4 points. Be consistent. Now the conclusion. The tasks in the conclusion, there are 3 of them, and 2 of them you have already done in the introduction. You just have to make a plan to do them again. In the conclusion, you want to make a plan to review the points covered in detail in the body, restate the main idea, and call your audience to action. So the review, you should follow the same guidelines you followed in the introduction. If the content is descriptive, you should review by listing the topics by name. If the content was narrative, a story, you should make a plan to again mention the time frame of the story briefly. You might make a plan to say something like, so over this period of 2 weeks I learned a very valuable lesson. And there you now have a transition into the main idea, which you have to restate in the conclusion. The next task, restate the main idea. Again, briefly as you did in the introduction, so that the audience will recognize it as the point of the story. The third task in the conclusion is to call your audience to action. The call to action is a way of demonstrating for your audience that your main idea exists in their world too. Hopefully they already know that, and this will just serve as a reminder. So a good way to frame your call to action is to preface it with a phrase like, so the next time you, and then complete that sentence with a specific but common hypothetical problem that could come up in the everyday life of your average audience member, in which the action that they would take to resolve the problem is reflective of your main idea. Okay, so we have covered the tasks to accomplish in the introduction, body, and conclusion of an informative speech. Once again, in the introduction you have 4 tasks: to establish the main idea, establish common ground with your audience, establish a personal connection to the subject, and preview a specific number of points. In the body, you have 1 task, and that is to elaborate in detail on the points previewed. In the conclusion, you have 3 tasks: to review the points covered in detail in the body, to restate the main idea, and to call your audience to action.